Momentarily for class solidarity, cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed, deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights, highlight the issue, talking heads left is best, the saga continues. The Nomiki Show.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. It is Wednesday, May 25th. Oh, how fast time flies. I can't believe we're already in summer, but I'm so ready for it. We have an incredible show today. We are going to be talking. This is like I think, fascinating conversation. You know how the right wing is like trying to be really funny and they want to use humor to their advantage. Well, there is a new book out called Rightfully So, That's Not Funny, How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. We're going to have Nick Marx on, who is one of the co-authors of that book that's out right now. I actually don't think they're funny, but they've been doing this for years. I've seen them on Fox News. I've been on panels with some of these guys who think they're so funny. It ain't funny, in my opinion. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and the movement behind that. And then first up, really excited to have Alex Kotch join us again. Alex is an investigative reporter. He is the co-founder of Opt Out and is a co-host of GildedAge Podcast. And is a member of the Freelance Solidarity Project. You know him probably from Exposed by Center for Media and Democracy. He has a piece out right now titled The Dirty Dozen, the biggest nonprofit funders of climate denial, that came out in March. But we're going to talk about it because this is an issue that ain't going away anytime soon. There you are, out in the wilderness. Alex, look at you, taking in that beautiful day.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. Thanks for having me.
Of course. One of my favorite episodes I ever did was I was at a conference in Greece last year, and there was this cafe that was like right up against the beach, like very, very Greek, like outside of Athens. And I got to film the entire episode with the ocean just like crashing by. It was really cool. So you can do it from anywhere, let me tell you.
All
right.
It's not an ocean, but it's a balcony. You know, we'll take that.
You know what? I'll take it right now. I have no light in here, so... So Alex, let's talk about who are these people. We know that we know that there's a lot of big money that is funneled through lots of different entities to make sure that climate denial, which is crazy that people are still denying climate change, to make sure that it just stays present. This movement to slow down the existence, the acknowledgement of climate change. You're saying there's some nonprofit funders. How does that play out? Like, what does a nonprofit do to push this?
Well, yeah, and that's a good point you make, is that, most of the world has accepted that climate change is happening and that humans are causing it. But you have very wealthy special interests in certain areas of the world, especially the United States, who are funding nonprofit groups that continue to spew out this, I guess I would say, toxic misinformation and disinformation about climate change, denying it or minimizing it to the benefit of oil companies and the general business community. So people for a long time have known that the fossil fuel companies, the oil giants, the coal companies have typically funded some of these nonprofit groups that put out phony papers and misinform the public. But what's underreported is that other nonprofit organizations, often private family foundations or kind of donor advised fund sponsors, in other words, money managers of individual donors, are giving millions every year to these groups. So it's easy to call out the fossil fuel companies. It takes a little more work to figure out where the money's coming from in terms of nonprofits.
So does it start with like these billionaire sources and then they put it into like an LLC? Is it sort of similar to like money laundering, essentially?
Well, in the terms of donor advised funds, it is a form of, what they do is they hide the identity of the donor and they invest the money in certain ways until it's ready to be distributed. So just to quickly try and summarize a fairly complicated financial arrangement. Today in philanthropy, donor advised funds are very popular. So what that means is that as an individual or potentially as a group, you can create your own charitable fund that's managed by a company or an investment firm or another charity itself. So what they do is they give you the charitable tax deduction. You put your money into this account, and then you tell that company or money manager when and how to distribute the money to other 501c3 nonprofit organizations. So what that does is it allows the donor to remain anonymous if they like. And so a lot of the funding we're seeing going to climate disinformation groups is from these anonymous donors who pretty clearly don't want their names attached to the money, but still want to fund climate denial and climate misinformation. So first and foremost is the right-wing duo of Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund. These are these kind of donor advised fund sponsors, but they typically fund the right. And they've poured, over $20 million into climate denial groups from 2014 to 2020.
Wow. Okay. And when you That's a lot of money that can be used very effectively throughout the already very friendly right-wing media and into the mainstream. But so we may not know the names, but I'm just gonna guess, and I'm, I don't think it's like a secret who some of the wealthy individuals are in this country who want to slow down any sort of climate change response. Are they tied to industries that make money off of climate change being not in the foray?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, we just one of the types of donors to these groups, and I should say some of these groups, as you're showing on your screen, the Heartland Institute,
Right.
one of the most notorious climate denial groups in the country, Competitive Enterprise Institute, PERC, the third one there.
Mm-hmm.
These are all groups that have been spreading misinformation for a long time, and they're funded very heavily by right-wing political donors. So, not only are these donor advised fund sponsors giving money to these groups, but the private family foundations of the usual suspects, like the family of Charles Koch, the oil billionaire, the family of the Searle Freedom Trust, and that's actually the family that was behind NutraSweet. So their family company invented aspartame, which
Why do they
popularly
care?
is the brand NutraSweet, and they're one of the biggest funders of climate misinformation in the last 7 years. So
Wait, but
a lot of people don't know that.
why does, I mean, NutraSweets, it's not like they're real estate or oil or why do they care? I mean, I'm sure they've cross invested in other places. It's not like people make their money and keep it in one spot. But the NutraSweet family, like they're one of the biggest funders? It's
Yeah,
bizarre.
I'm not really sure who in the family perhaps is super right wing like this, but a lot of these wealthy kind of heirs and heiresses type people want to protect their money, and so they've kind of uh, opened themselves up to sort of the Koch libertarian network of and way of thinking. They call themselves free enterprise conservatives, when in reality, that what they're just trying to do is protect their wealth and make more of it, and get tax breaks while they do it. So they're putting their money directly into these groups, and some of them also use the donor advised funds to donate as well. And if we continue a little bit down the list.
Mhm.
There's the Sarah Scaife Foundation. That's one of the foundations that was originally overseen by Richard Mellon Scaife, who was one of the heirs to the Gilded Age Mellon family fortune that
Wow.
was made from oil, aluminum, and banking. So, a lot of these are big money from many, many years ago that has been kind of converted into foundations. Over time, that money grows with interest because it's invested heavily in the market. And now they're funding, some of the most deadly causes on the planet.
It's really interesting. Do they all communicate with each other? I mean, you say they go into funding this climate denial messaging and through nonprofits, of course, but are they all kind of coordinated? Are they using the same messaging? Do they talk to each other? Do we have any sense of what that community is like?
It's hard to say exactly, but I do think there's plenty of communication if they want it. First of all, Donors Trust, as an ideological donor advised fund sponsor, has the ability to coordinate their top donors in any way they want or connect them. A lot of some of the operatives at Donors Trust are actually also work for some of these climate denial groups. So um, the Property and Environmental Research Center, or otherwise known as PERC, has some overlapping staff with Donors Trust. So does the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And actually, the co-founder and board chair of Donors Trust, Kimberly Dennis, is on the board of PERC. So there's certainly a lot of communication between these funds and the climate denial groups, and also the same goes for the foundations. Some of them also fund organizations that are part of the State Policy Network, which is a right-wing network of state-based think tanks, kind of that coordinates with the American Legislative Exchange Council to pass write and promote legislation on the right wing, and that includes legislation that is penalizing companies that financial firms that divest from fossil fuels by preventing them from getting government contracts in the states that pass those kinds of laws.
When you say that they're climate deniers and that's their mission, what does that look like today? I mean, are they just flat out like, yeah, that's not real? I mean, when you turn on Fox Business, are they still pretending that climate change isn't real, or is it more like what is it that's causing climate change is not what we think it is. It's just natural, or whatever their messaging is. I'm just curious where they stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them are probably not quite as overtly saying that the climate is not changing, but they're doing a lot of what they've always done is sow doubt into that, and also deflect. So a lot of times you'll have some of these people from these think tanks just kind of first of all going on friendly media that's not going to ask the hard questions first,
Right.
and then also just sidestepping any actual issues that matter, and just kind of lying and putting out industry propaganda about the benefits of natural gas or the benefits of so-called clean coal, neither of which are remotely helpful to the environment. So it's a lot of deflection, and it's a lot of kind of stewing the pot in misinformation, in addition to the occasional flat out denial, from what I've seen.
So, a lot of this stuff is out in the open now. We're due to reporters like you who are doing the hard work of following the money. I mean, this is like real hardcore following the money for folks who want to know. It's not easy. These are names that, I mean, the Mercers, for instance, are known now. Their power, it's out there. The story's out. Is there any sort of movement to, say, challenge their IRS status for XYZ reasons that might be violating what, they have, they're tax-free with these foundations. Is there any other sort of like government oversight or any other sort of like challenges that are out there right now?
Well, that's a good question. I don't actually know the answer, but I would say that there's definitely grounds to challenge the nonprofit tax status of these organizations like the Heartland Institute that are clearly only doing damage to the planet and to humans and to other species on the planet. So I think it would be hard to argue before a committee or in court that they're actually a public benefit and that they deserve us taxpayers to subsidize them, because that's actually what we do. We are paying the tax that they should be paying, essentially. So the idea that you should, be an organization committed to lying about climate change and get, subsidized by us is outrageous. The same goes for white nationalist hate groups. There's several who are still nonprofits, charities in good status with the IRS, which also I've reported on at CMD and at Sludge. VDARE, for example, and American Renaissance, two of the most notorious white nationalist groups, obviously kind of in the news now, or at least excited about the most recent terror attack in Buffalo. So I don't mean to diverge from our climate conversation, but the same issue pertains to other really malicious nonprofit groups. So if there isn't discussion about challenging the tax status, I think there certainly should be.
Alex, before you leave, tell us a little bit more about opt-out. You've been on before, you told us, but for folks who may not have tuned in, what's opt-out? How can people engage? How, what's on the radar today at opt-out? Great.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad for that question and the opportunity to always talk about opt-out. And I will just say quickly, in the intro to my article, it talks about the latest IPCC report, the International Climate Report, and they actually, for the first time ever, call out misinformation in the media about climate. And so they definitely call out right-wing news outlets, but they also call it the mainstream, and they say that there's a false equivalence between people who are realists about climate and people who are deniers. That's been kind of promoted by a lot of the corporate and legacy media outlets. They've gotten better, but they're still doing it. And so that's the reason why you're part of the Opt-Out Network, why Walker Bragman and I founded it, which is a network of over 150 news outlets that are financially independent, that are trustworthy, and do really great, important work about the issues that matter. We're not being paid by Chevron or Exxon to do sponsored content. We are not having on oil lobbyists and not disclosing conflicts of interest. That's the kind of trust I think that people really need in the media at a time when we're at an all-time low in trust in American media. So as you can see, that's the website optout.news for our network. We have video channels like this one. We have digital websites, and we have podcasts, over 150 of them, all in one app, totally free and available on iOS, for iPad and iPhone right now, and very shortly for Android. So please don't despair. We're almost ready to release the Android beta. And I'm really glad for you, Nomi, and your show for being one of the first members of the group. and it's grown since then, since we first chatted about it in 2020.
You've been so dedicated to this, to see how much it's grown and to see your advisors too. I mean, you have some really all-star advisors who've been leading you throughout this process. So if you haven't already checked out Opt Out, go check it out. The app is really easy to use too. And go look at the advisors also, because this is a crew of folks who are dedicated to supporting independent media, to supporting good quality journalism like Alex is doing. Alex does the work. He is dedicated. I mean, there are a lot of people in the journalism world who may start one way, but they get worn down because, shocker, there's not a lot of money in journalism, and there's not a lot of money in good journalism and places to go. With that being said, Alex has stayed dedicated, and not only that, he's building this he's a great ally. So you've built this platform for other journalists who are just as dedicated. Great having you on. Always a pleasure.
Oh, yeah. Thanks so much, Nomi. Anytime.
All right. Thanks to Alex Kotch. Go check out his story right now. It is at it's Onyx. We have the link up in the information section. It's titled "The Dirty Dozen: The Biggest Nonprofit Funders of Climate Denial." It is part of the Center for Media and Democracy's investigation section, Exposed, which is a lot of it is following the money. Great work there. All right, we'll be right back after this break with Nick Marx to talk about humor on the right.
The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.
Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, the right wing thinks they're so funny, and they have all these comedians. They have their own little circular comedian community that just thinks they're the funniest people in town. I don't know about you, but I've listened to some of these guys and they kind of suck. But, there is a little bit of a legacy of that. Nick Marx is an associate professor of film and media studies at Colorado State University, and he is the author of Sketch Comedy and has co-authored many other books, including Comedy Studies Reader, Saturday Night Live, and American TV. And his new book, which he's here to talk about today, is That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them. Thank you for joining us, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me.
What an interesting space to live in. It must be a lot of fun, but with this book, I mean, was it as fun as, say, covering SNL and other aspects of comedy in our ecosystem?
I mean, the short answer is no, because I don't like many of the subjects that we write about in this book. However, the argument we're making is not to stop at that taste-based judgment of right-wing comedy. That's why we called the book That's Not Funny, because many on the left understandably have that taste-based reaction to it. I don't like it, that's not funny. But what we point out is that this causes us on the left to underestimate comedy's power as a recruitment tool, especially for the young men who tend to populate the online spaces of the comedy universe, the comedy clubs, comedy podcasts. And to move beyond that and acknowledge its power as a political recruitment tool and not just something that's a diversionary pastime.
You are a prophet. I'm telling you, this is, we talk about this a lot on our show because we are, our show it's a female hosted show, and I do kind of overlap with the political comedian space, but it's not really my jam because I'm not their target audience. It doesn't mean that I don't have a sense of humor. Doesn't mean I don't like comedy. It's just, it's different. And so what I've seen though is being in this space, so many people are being recruited through the comedy, world on the right. And some even from the comedy world on the left, they've somehow found an issue that they align on. So can you help us understand, is this was this a strategy? Has this always been part of it, or is there just sort of an overlapping, it's like coincidental how comedy and the right became a tool?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure that there's any overt collective strategy at work here, as much as there is a kind of natural outgrowth of the Trump presidency in 2016. So the kind of time period we're working with more or less begins with Trump setting the tone, giving a permission structure for more right-wing voices to enter mainstream commercial spaces using comedy. So it's not a groundbreaking thing to point out that Trump himself modeled many of the things that stand-up comics do, improvising, doing crowd work, turning members of the audience against one another, right? He was also mean-spirited and punched down in the jokes that he made about folks, whether they were Mexican migrants, LGBT community, the disabled journalist, right, from very early on in his campaign. So that tone of sort of using the superiority humor, the thing that makes the joker feel good about themselves at the expense of a culturally marginalized group, is very common, starting with Trump, and explodes across the right-wing media sphere on Fox News in the form of Greg Gutfeld, in the libertarian spaces that Joe Rogan kind of marshals and hangs out in, and many beyond that.
That's interesting. But it's, even with Donald Trump, he's pals with Dennis, what's his name? Dennis Leary? The comedian, the guy who they used to go on Fox News together, and Dennis used to go on, why do I know this? He used to go on Bill O'Reilly's show, and they would all go to baseball games or whatever games, I don't know, games together, because they're, strong men. But yeah, I mean, and Fox has been on some of these shows where they used to have these like late night comedy shows for sort of the edgier, maybe even like young libertarian audience to tune in. And then when I would go on those shows, even though the ratings were probably much lower than the rest of Fox News, their engagement online was always like cultish. And that was maybe 10 years ago. And to see how it's sort of manifested into these other spaces through podcasts and of course, Joe Rogan. The funny thing about this, to me, I find it hilarious, is they're not even funny. Like, so what, how is this work? Is it just like a massive therapy session for men to just like beat up on people? Not therapy, but a session for them all to come together and beat up on others and not take responsibility for their role in the world?
Yeah, it's tricky. The humor that we describe in the book oftentimes lacks the conventional setup, punchline, joking that you'd be used to in any number of formats, in a comedy club, on the Colbert Report, or Colbert nowadays. But that doesn't mean they're not using comedic discourse or trying to make jokes as a way to not only galvanize a group of like-minded folks around themselves and a common cause, but also, and this is much more important, to identify a common enemy, owning the libs, right? So they use comedy to point out who they're against much more often and much more powerfully than they do to advance a common cause. As we write about in the book, the sort of coalition of right-wing comedians is actually pretty broad and at times contradictory. So you've got the sort of evangelical Christianity of the Babylon Bee paired with the sort of libertine.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, that site is very religious in its sort of first principles and the way that it sort of views things like gay rights and transgender rights, for instance. You've got that paired alongside the very bro-ish, masculine, libertarian voices of Joe Rogan and Legion of Skanks and some of these other folks. Might not expect them to be sort of united in their political front, but they know how to get together when it's time to own the libs and to sort of say, well, at least we're not Bernie Sanders supporters. At least we're not nose ring wearing anarchists or whatever the sort of caricature of the left is.
But it's interesting because some of them were Bernie Sanders supporters. You have Joe Rogan, who came out for Bernie Sanders, and he spills over with this edge of what they call themselves the left comedic space, where maybe a few years ago they fit more conventionally in the left, but they've been taking a slower turn to the right, whether it's Bill Maher or Jimmy Dore or some of these other folks that do comedy, have done comedy clubs, and but now they've like partnered up with Rogan. Is that, do you think that's an intentional way to like pull more people from the left to a dying conservative movement?
Absolutely. So the case we make for Rogan in the book is that Rogan doesn't have politics. He's got demographics. His is first and foremost a project to recruit young men, many of whom may have been hanging out in sort of left-leaning spaces and supporters of Sanders and others. But his project is kind of politically ambivalent. You know, he endorsed Bernie in 2020 and had him on the show, and then he swung over to Trump. So he's not a sort of conventional Republican voice in the right-wing universe, but the connections he has to other right-leaning and far-right voices via the guests he has on his show, the people he platforms and interacts with on social media, and then the types, you've got Ben Shapiro up on screen, right? And the types of guests that his guests have on their shows and they interact with on social media undeniably paint him in the corner of sort of right-wing spaces, especially when it comes to cultural, economic issues, even if he does retain some of that, you used the word edge before, and I think that's the right way to look at it, because many far-left comedians have that same sort of anti-institutional edge that Rogan does too, and he's definitely shaving off some of that appeal from the far left as a way to kind of have them peek over into his universe and be like, well, if I like edgy racial humor, maybe I'll check out this Milo Yiannopoulos character or some other sort of trolling type person he has on the show.
It's a pipeline, essentially.
Yes. Yeah, we describe it in the book as a complex. It's a structure of like-minded comedians who all interconnect and have each other on one another's shows and promote one another and appear on each other's podcasts, even if they sell different types of products. So the libertarian Rogan folks are selling you Butcher Box and pubic hair trimmers and off-brand Viagra, right? But the mainstream sitcom of Tim Allen, for instance, is doing a bit of a different right-wing comedy business. He's attracting an older, wealthier boomer type who, even though they're laughing at different things, they sure agree that the libs are the ones to laugh at and own and defeat politically.
And cancel culture, of course, because they're all just victims of cancel culture.
Correct.
So this is a disagreement, a regular disagreement I have between my dear friend Sam Seder from the Majority Report, who is a comedian. We had it last week. I feel like the audience was like, okay, we've had enough of this. We agree on everything, right? It's just sort of like, how did it happen? I am of the belief that Joe Rogan has always been in the game of being on the right and pushing the right, because some of his earliest guests were right there in our faces, like Alex Jones. Now, he became tremendously popular, and there's a reward mechanism in this, and it's harder and harder to take him off Spotify, not just erasing a couple of episodes here and there. Sam is of the mindset that Joe is just like a dumb comedian and didn't know what he's doing. And this just works, and he's not going to let it go, and he's making a lot of money. But I think, at least, I don't know how he got into it, but I think at least at this point, he is part of something much more sophisticated. Sam does not think so.
I think it's a bit of both. I think it's tricky. Rogan, when he is at his best, and I'll use that term generously, he is talking shop with other stand-up comics about the craft of comedy. And I think that's where his home base is. He just likes hanging out with the fellows, tossing back a few shots, and talking about the craft of comedy. But if he were to, let's see, himself or his supporters denying a broader political affiliation is hilarious at this point. It's impossible to make that case, right? He is so intimately bound up into bigger right-wing cultural infrastructures that he no longer has the plausible deniability of saying, look, man, I'm just a comedian. I'm, making jokes. Don't take any of this too seriously. That all went out the window, most recently, at least, with the COVID denial sort of controversy, and then the sort of edited tape of him saying the N-word over and over again, right? After a while, there's a ton of smoke there, and it's undeniable. But I think if you were to get him in a room by himself, speaking very candidly, which I guess his podcast does, he would revert back to, yeah, I'm just a comedian. Don't take anything I say too seriously. Well, you lose that sort of plausible deniability when you've got 12 million Spotify listeners,
That's right.
many of whom go on to have connections to these other parts of the right-wing comedy universe. And the further and further connected we go down into what we call the basement of right-wing trolling, some pretty nefarious characters, right? It doesn't take that much effort to get from Milo Yiannopoulos to outright alt-right trolls and people who attend to Unite the Right and are up to some pretty real-world nasty stuff.
It's interesting because he's become a platform for folks to legitimize other folks, and we see this on a micro level too. There's sort of like a step by step. There's a blogger that shows up one day, or not a blogger, a YouTube host that's not verified shows up one day, and all they have to do, all they want to do is just attack liberals who are not leaving the Democratic Party, but like want to increase voter turnout and get more progressives elected. I'm just using that as an example. And all this random host in his basement, maybe in his early 20s, has no experience. All they do is just shit on the libs all day long as an ultimate liberal, as a perfect liberal. Then 3 or 4 months later, you see them on Jimmy Dore's show, huge platform, regularly, or Jimmy Dore goes on their show. And then suddenly they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They're right on the Hill, the Hill TV, and then maybe they make it onto Joe Rogan. I mean, to me, that's just, I know how campaigns work. That's what you do on campaigns. You try to get on, platform, and you have exchanges. So it's not something that's accidental. So it does seem like there's sort of like a level, like how, okay, you've reached this level. Now you're going to go to the next level, and we're just going to keep growing our network. Because that's how Fox News always worked. They always platformed, cited small blogs, and disperse them throughout their show. This is just in a different ecosystem now.
Precisely, yeah. So Rogan is a front door. He may not be the main spot of where sort of ideological rightward turning is happening, but he opens the door of possibilities to right-wing curious folks. The Fox News example is another great one because of folks like Gutfeld, who start out as kind of unconventional, wry, ironic, late-night looking hosts as far back as the mid-2000s on Red Eye. And he's groomed to be a star on that network. He eventually works up to the 5, and he's got his own show, the Greg Gutfeld Show. So now he's got his own nightly show that's competing directly opposite the Daily Show, right, in that 11 Eastern time slot, explicitly positioning itself as a late-night comedy show. And he does the same kind of thing. He's got sort of low-level, mid-level comedians who sort of do their spots there, hoping to work their way up the chain to other platforms like Rogan and elsewhere. So a lot of times somebody like Gutfeld, maybe to a lesser extent, but certainly Rogan, may take the cover of I'm just a comedian, don't take me too seriously, but their connections to the rest of the right-wing universe are undeniable at this point.
He's not even funny. At least Tom Shalhoub had a little bit of humor. Where'd he go? Is he still around?
I think he's still a bit player. So he used to host sometimes in Gutfeld's absence his previous show, but he does the Biden impersonation on Gutfeld.
Oh, he does?
He'll pop up.
Red Eye for a while.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
He's like a knockoff Conan O'Brien.
Yes, that's
Conan O'Brien, in my opinion.
That's exactly right. Gutfeld has a sort of stable of sketch players, much like Conan did in the late 90s with Amy Poehler and others. To call him anything other than an out-and-out comedian would be dishonest at this point.
Exactly. Back to Joe Rogan real quick, because I do think it's fascinating. You say that it's undeniable. He's working for this publicly traded company. And what I remind folks is that he has people on his staff that, we have a small staff here. We have a rundown every day. We know what we're going to talk about. We have write-ups on stuff. We know who our guests are. You talk to your host, once a week or maybe a couple times a week to discuss what you're going to plan for the show. It's not like he goes in there and he's just having a conversation with his friends. He has a major staff around him that's working through this stuff. So it's not like he accidentally said the N-word or accidentally took a position. He's having guests on that are, in some cases, very involved in Q-related activities. Alex Jones is the classic example, but Ben Shapiro, they know what they're doing. This isn't an accident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that Rogan shares with some of the left leaning comedians is a skepticism of institutions, right? He doesn't like any sort of official news source or any sort of official party line on COVID vaccines or anything like that, even though he kind of plays as I'm just making this shit up as I go along, don't take anything I say too seriously. I think you're right. It would be a kind of mischaracterization to say that he's purely going off the cuff. I think that's part of a kind of his performative appeal at this point, is that he mimics the sort of hangout session that you and your friends might have where you're saying, yeah, do I really need to get the shot, or do I need to make my bed and take my vitamins like Dr. Jordan Peterson tells me to, right? But right, there's far too much money at stake. There's far too many ears to fill with that podcast for it all to be an accident, and for him to say like, oh no, I don't connect me to these far right characters. I just think that would be dishonest.
So what do you think can be done about this? Well, the book is great about educating folks, but yeah, is there more beyond just letting people know it's right in front of your face?
Yeah, so I'll admit that ours is not a prescriptive project. I'm not a political activist. I don't have the formula for winning this particular part of the culture war. The battle that my co-author Matt and I are still trying to fight is convincing our fellow liberals, and to a lesser extent leftists, that this is a thing, to take it seriously as a thing that has cultural power for folks on the right. So for far too long, we on the left assumed that comedy was the exclusive cultural domain of liberals. Because of Jon Stewart, because of Stephen Colbert, and I include myself in that camp, my political awakening was the 2003 Iraq War, and I thought, yes, these two voices are the ones who are going to guide us through it. But over the course of the last 20 years, we saw some of that cultural territory getting cut into by the right? The Breitbart sort of edict that politics is downstream from culture came to be true, that gradually these right-wing voices could kind of incur on our territory, and our sort of blinkers were, or rather our blinders were on. We didn't see this. We just thought, no, that's outrage programming. We don't have to take that seriously. It's whatever Meemaw is watching on Fox News that night. So it's not a thing that's good like Colbert is for me. So our main project is just to sort of get liberals to pay attention to right-wing comedy and take it seriously as a potential recruitment mechanism for the right, especially among that young male demographic that I mentioned early on.
I think it should be taken extremely seriously. If you have the budget to do so, maybe send it to like key members of Democratic Party leadership.
I would love
those who are going to read it and get it. Maybe briefed.
If you've got their ear, I'd love to get it in their hands.
We'll start a movement now. If they care, honestly, because they just supported an NRA congressman in Texas.
Bigger
day of
bigger things going on, right? Yeah, than letting Jessica Cisneros have a voice for Black and brown people in South Texas. God forbid.
God forbid that happen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, fascinating conversation. Definitely urge people to go check out your book called "That's Not Funny: How the Right Makes Comedy Work for Them." Nick Marx, just really great having you on today, and good luck with your book tour.
Thank you so much. Happy to be back anytime you'll have me.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Wednesday, May 25th. If you're not already, make sure to subscribe to us everywhere on YouTube, on Twitch. Of course, join us on patreon.com/Nomiki Show. We are on all of the podcast platforms now. So go to your favorite podcast place, and you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, all the places. But, just want to say extra thanks to our patrons, because you make this show happen, and we're always grateful to you. So if you're part of the patron community at Patreon, you have access to unique episodes, unique conversations. Sometimes we do Q&As, and of course there's swag there, so you can get a sticker, a mug, a bag, lots of stuff there, and it's a wonderful community. All right, everybody, have a wonderful afternoon, and as always, stay in solidarity.
Yeah. clash momentarily for class solidarity. Cash circulating, give the masses back its currency. Greed from elites, oligarchs stay fed. Deep state, fake fed, everybody break bread. Racism, homophobia, sexism, religion in this melting pot we live in. Time to build a new system, unionize labor rights. Highlight the issue, talking heads left is best. The saga continues. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show. The Nomiki Show.